This lesson is all about cakes, and I'll be introducing you to the simple classic that is adored the world over, and that is a sponge cake. And even though it might have different names in different countries, it almost always has the same formula. I'll take you through all the key elements that you need to know to start baking beautiful cakes at home. One of the first things to remember when it comes to baking a simple cake is that all of your ingredients need to be at room temperature. I kind of think of them as more relaxed once the chill from the fridge has worn off. Having softened room temperature butter means that it whips together with the sugar more easily, so you can incorporate more air when you're creaming the butter and sugar together. So I'm starting off with 200 grams of this room temperature butter. Then I'll reset the scale and add in 200 grams of caster sugar. So now we just need to cream this together for between 3 and 5 minutes until the butter and sugar are nice and light and fluffy. And you can get away with doing it on a fairly high speed. Then from time to time, I always just scrape down the sides of the mixing bowl with a spatula so that all the ingredients are nicely incorporated. And then I'll leave that to carry on mixing while I measure out the flour and the baking powder. So now I'm resetting my scale again, and I'm going to weigh out 200 grams of self-raising flour and then 1 teaspoon of baking powder. So just remember to sieve your baking powder and flour together so that the baking powder is evenly distributed through the flour. And that means that your cake will rise evenly. You don't want little pockets of extra high rising. Okay, the butter has creamed together beautifully and it's all soft and pillowy. And now I'm ready to add in the eggs. And it's really important that your eggs are at room temperature. If you add cold eggs to the butter and sugar mixture, they can curdle and all kind of splits and goes a bit like scrambled eggs. So they need to be at room temperature, and a quick way of bringing them to room temperature is just to pop them in a bowl of warm water for a few minutes and then they'll warm up perfectly. So I'm adding the eggs in 2 stages, and I'm adding flour in between each stage. That will also help the eggs to hold together and prevent them from curdling. And then I'm going to fold in a little bit of flour, about half the flour mixture. Then I'm adding in the remaining 2 eggs. And the rest of the flour. And then 1 teaspoon of vanilla. Okay, one final scrape down. It always amuses me actually, because of all the decadent treats in the world and all the pastries and cakes and even the chocolatiest chocolate cake, Rob, my husband, will choose a simple sponge every time. It's just his absolute favorite, and it somehow is so exquisite in its simplicity. It's kind of cake perfection, I think. So one last scrape down, one last little mix, and remember we don't want to overmix and overactivate the glutens. And then you always just look at the mixture and see if you need to add a little bit of milk to loosen it, because you want it just kind of dropping off your spoon or your spatula. What you may have noticed by now, if you've been paying close attention, is that I've used equal quantities of all the ingredients in this cake. So I started off with 200 grams of butter and then 200 grams of caster sugar, and then I added in 200 grams of self-raising flour. And the average weight of an egg is about 50 grams. So if you add 4 eggs together, you've got about 200 grams of eggs. So it's this very simple formula, and it's an introduction to the wonderful world of baking ratios. Now I just need to divide the mixture between my 2 baking tins, which are 20 centimeters in diameter, and they've already been greased, like I showed you in lesson 1. So I'm just spreading the mixture out as evenly as possible using the back of a tablespoon. These are ready to go into my preheated oven, which is at 190 degrees, and it's important to make sure that you put them on the middle shelf of your oven so that they get even air circulation while they're baking. A really helpful thing to remember is that if you don't have self-raising flour at home, you can make up your own by adding 2 teaspoons of baking powder to 1 cup of plain flour. And it's also important to remember that when you're working with raising agents like baking powder or baking soda, you must measure carefully, because if you add too much raising agent, I always think of it as something that gets over enthusiastic and then it kind of collapses, and that's exactly what happens to your cake. It'll rise too much and then fall back on itself. While the cake bakes for the next 20 minutes or so, I'm just getting the ingredients ready for the filling and the topping of the cake. And here I have homemade passion fruit curd, and then all I do is dust the top of the cake with a little shower of icing sugar. Now it's time to check if the cake is nearly ready, and one of the surest signs that it's coming close is that you can start to smell it. So there's almost no point in checking if your cake's ready before the minimum time of baking has elapsed, and also before you can actually smell those gorgeous cake fumes coming through your house. So all I do is insert the skewer. The skewer has come away perfectly clean, which means the cake is cooked all the way through. And another little test that I did is just to press gently on the surface of the cake, and if it springs back, you know that it's done, which makes perfect sense because it is a sponge cake. I hope that you've enjoyed our ultimate guide to simple sponge cakes, and that now you have the confidence to try one at home. Don't forget that we have extra recipes, course notes, top tips and quizzes available as well. And I will see you in the next lesson.